The iron gates of the Thorne estate were rarely silent, but in the heat of the late August afternoon of 1858, they were singing, a deafening symphony of hammers, carriage wheels, and the insistent chatter of the finest society Richmond had to offer. Every sound was a note counted and filed by Ilara. She heard the forced cheer in the voices of the field hands pressed into service as waiters. She heard the nervous, high-pitched laughter of the house staff, desperate not to cross Master Percival. And she heard, most clearly, the relentless ticking of the French grandfather clock in the main hall. Everything was building toward the wedding, which was merely an ornate curtain shielding a desperate transaction. Ilara, standing near the linen press, felt the chaos not as confusion, but as cover. The louder the world got, the more invisible she became. Valued at less than the mahogany credenza she polished daily, Ilara moved through the mansion like a draft. 30 years old, she had served in the house since childhood, eventually becoming the constant shadow of Mistress Clarissa, Percival Thorne's flighty, vain, and often sickly younger sister. It was a servitude that required a unique skill, not just observation, but mimicry. Ilara knew how Clarissa held her teacup, the precise tilt of her head when feigning interest, the cadence of her exaggerated coughs, and the way her eyes clouded over when sherry replaced reason. This intimate knowledge was paid for dearly. It was under Percissa's cruel supervision and Percival's cold indifference that Ilara's younger sister May had been left to burn with fever in the quarters, deemed expendable labor, until the flame extinguished her entirely 5 years prior. That night was the end of many things for Ilara. It was the end of tears. It was the end of hope built on prayer. In its place settled a cold, precise rage that did not burn, but crystallized. It was a ledger meticulously kept in the silent chambers of her mind, each cruelty, each debt, tallied with surgical accuracy. May's life was worth nothing to the Thornes, but the cost of her death, Ilara decided, would be infinite. And this wedding, this extravagant display of stolen wealth and planned financial salvation, was the ultimate opportunity for settlement. Percival Thorne was a man drowning in debt while attempting to swim in high cotton. His plantation, while visually grand, was failing, the soil exhausted, his ventures in cotton futures proving disastrous. The marriage to Miss Genevieve Ashton, the heiress from Philadelphia, was not just a convenience. It was a lifeline, a several $1,000 injection that would save him from foreclosure and public shame. His arrogance was his greatest shield and his most fatal flaw. He saw nothing he did not wish to see. He saw Ilara, when he saw her at all, as an extension of the dustcloth she wielded. "Ilara, are you deaf? The embroidery on the third table runner, it's crooked. Do you want me whipped before the guests arrive? Fix it." Clarissa's voice, already strained by nerves and half a bottle of sherry, cut through the hallway noise. "Yes, mistress," Ilara replied, her voice a low murmur, the very sound of submission. She smoothed the linen, her fingers moving with impossible steadiness, the same hands that were currently hiding the small, oiled surgical knife, a relic stolen years ago from the discarded supplies of the estate doctor, Dr. Bellamy. She had been sharpening it for months, honing the edge until it was invisible, capable of passing unnoticed beneath a finger's touch. It was not a weapon of confrontation, but of precision. Clarissa, a woman whose health had always been a source of drama and attention, was particularly unsuited to the strains of hosting a high society pre-wedding gala. She was pale, her features pinched, but her vanity forced her down the sweeping oak staircase, determined to see and be seen by the few early arrivals. She paused dramatically halfway, swaying slightly as she clung to the banister, addressing a cluster of guests below about the superior quality of the European lace she insisted on wearing the following day. Ilara stood 3 steps above, ostensibly adjusting the train of Clarissa's silk dress, but inwardly measuring the distance, calculating the angle. She had observed Clarissa's gait for a decade. She knew the exact point of imbalance. But this was vengeance, not murder in haste. It had to be Percival, and it had to be symbolic. Then fate intervened with a cruelty of its own. Clarissa, attempting a grand theatrical gesture with her glass, missed the edge of the stair entirely. The sound was sickening, a sharp crack, followed by the heavy, dull thud of a body not designed for impact. The crystal shattered first, a bright, momentary sparkle, then the silence, which was far louder than the crash. Percival burst from the dining room, not rushing to his sister, but to the silence. His face, usually a mask of haughty control, was stripped bare, revealing panic and fury. "Clarissa! Clarissa! What in God's name?" He stopped, staring at the motionless figure crumpled at the foot of the stairs, her head resting at an unnatural angle. A small, dark pool of liquid spread slowly beneath her. Red wine, or something worse. The house dissolved into controlled hysteria. Servants moved, trained to clean up messes without speaking. Ilara was the first to reach Clarissa, her face showing the correct, practiced expression of concern, while her mind was already running calculations. Velocity, injury, chances of recovery. Low, very low. Percival dragged Ilara away from the scene, his breath sour with brandy. "Get the damn doctor. The wedding is tomorrow. If she can't stand, she's useless." "Sir, she is unconscious," Ilara stated quietly, pulling the white shawl of the fainting woman over the wound. "She struck her head badly, and her leg is surely broken." "I don't care if her spine is dust," Percival hissed, grabbing her arm so tightly Ilara knew a bruise would blossom later. "Genevieve Ashton is arriving in the morning. She is expecting a sister-in-law, a traditional southern wedding. I cannot call this off. I will be ruined, Ilara, ruined." The sheer self-absorption was breathtaking. May died because she was a commodity, and Clarissa could die now, and Percival's only sorrow was the threat to his ledger. Dr. Bellamy arrived 20 minutes later, sweaty and smelling faintly of ether. He examined Clarissa quickly in the small sitting room where she had been moved. Ilara held the lamp, ensuring the shadows fell exactly where they needed to, making the damage look slightly worse, slightly more irreversible. Bellamy looked at Percival, accepting the offered envelope of cash without blinking. "Percival, she cannot move. A terrible concussion, perhaps a fracture. She will not wake before morning, perhaps not for days. And when she does, she won't be fit for company." Percival ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting frantically around the room, settling first on the thick, obfuscating lace of the bridal veil, then on Ilara. That was the moment. The silence between the master and the maid was thick with unacknowledged realization. Ilara had always been told she was Clarissa's mirror. Not a beautiful mirror, necessarily. Since Ilara's skin was darker, her hands rougher, but the bone structure, the height, the long lines of the neck, they were strikingly similar. It was a common, cruel jest among the guests, how the maid looked more like the master's family than the sister herself. Percival, blinded by the desperation of saving his name and his fortune, didn't see Ilara. He saw a solution wearing a plain calico dress. "Ilara," he began, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You know everything about Clarissa, how she walks, how she sits." Ilara lowered her gaze, folding her hands in front of her. "I have been her shadow, Master Percival, for 10 years. The dress fits, the veil is thick. Genevieve is a Yankee girl. She's never met Clarissa. The guests will be too drunk and too focused on the transaction to look too closely." He paced, his plan forming rapidly, ugly and magnificent in its sheer arrogance. "You will wear the dress. You will walk down the aisle. You will say, 'I do.' You will keep your head bowed, claim a sudden migraine, and retire immediately after the ceremony. No one touches the bride until the honeymoon in Charleston. Do you understand?" Ilara looked up, ensuring her eyes showed only confusion and fear. "Sir, I am not Mistress Clarissa. What if I am discovered?" "You won't be. You are a ghost, Ilara. You've been invisible for 30 years. Just be quiet. Be her shadow one last time." He added, dangerously soft, "If you fail, the price will be the same as if you ran, and far more painful." He didn't need to threaten her. The mention of failure only sharpened her focus. This wasn't failure. This was ascension. She wasn't just stepping into Clarissa's shoes. She was walking straight into the most protected, most symbolic fortress of Percival's life, his marriage bed. And she was bringing the final bill. "I understand, Master Percival," she said, her voice steady and low. "I will be Mistress Clarissa." The rest of the night was a dizzying rush of preparation. Percival, his breath smelling of mint and panic, swore the few servants involved, a maid, the old valet, and Ilara herself, to secrecy, using threats of the deep woods and promises of extra rations. Ilara focused not on the grand, absurd details, but on the small, manageable ones. She found Clarissa's favorite scented powder and rubbed it heavily onto her neck and wrists to mask the scent of sweat and plain lye soap. She practiced Clarissa's high, affected laugh twice in front of the mirror, rejecting it as too risky. Silence was better. Silence was safety. Silence was power. She studied the movement of the veil. It was heavy Brussels lace, designed to obscure the face until the moment of the kiss, if there even was one. She calculated the distance between the altar and the bridal suite. 47 steps, 3 distinct landings. Later, hidden under the rough blanket in her small room behind the pantry, Ilara unwrapped the surgical blade. It was small, no longer than her index finger, sharpened to a wicked point. The plan had shifted from vague, long-term vengeance to immediate, specific execution. The marriage bed of Percival Thorne, a man who believed himself untouchable, would be the scene of his reckoning. She slipped the knife into the perfectly stitched seam of the glove she would wear. The lace would hide the bulk. Her hands, honed by years of manual labor and controlled emotion, would not shake. She closed her eyes, but she did not rest. She was visualizing the map of the grand bedroom upstairs, studying the path Percival would take, the positioning of the lamps, and most importantly, the quick, vulnerable targets hidden beneath the pomp of the fine white shirt he would wear. Ilara knew the risk was absolute, total. If she succeeded, she would not live to see the next dawn. She accepted this willingly. May's ghost deserved a silence that resonated louder than any fanfare. The quiet maid who counted words and steps was about to spend her own life as currency. The bell tolled 4 in the morning, just enough time for a final, meticulous check. She rose, leaving the cramped quarters for the last time. As she walked toward the grand central staircase, she passed the sitting room where Clarissa still lay, breathing shallowly, oblivious to the fact that her maid was about to steal the most important day of her life. Ilara paused only for a moment, a recognition of shared captivity before ascending to meet her destiny. The sun would rise in a few hours, but before it did, the silent bride would have her wedding night. The upper chamber was not merely a room, it was a testament to entrenched privilege, a soaring vault of wealth rendered in silks and mahogany. The scent of lavender and beeswax warred weakly against the fainter metallic aroma that clung to Ilara's skin. The scent of the cellar, of crushed herbs and stored desperation. She stood in the center, the heavy lace of the wedding dress feeling less like fabric and more like armor forged of deceit. The room was prepared for consummation, the linens turned back, the fire banked low to ward off the faint autumnal chill of South Carolina, which, even in its mildness, could creep into the bones. Ilara moved to the dressing table, her movement slow, deliberate, rehearsed 100 times in the shadows of the attic. She peeled off the white kid gloves, noticing the faint ridge of a callus on her thumb, a mark earned not by wielding a needle for fine lace, but by scraping raw herbs from stone. This callus, hidden beneath the white silk, was the only honest thing about the appearance she presented tonight. She had Clarissa's hair, Clarissa's jewels, even Clarissa's vacant, slightly upward tilt of the chin, which the girl mistook for aristocracy. but the mind underneath was entirely her own, a tightly wound spring of memory and purpose. A silver tray sat waiting on a small table near the bed, holding 2 crystal glasses and a half-full decanter of French brandy. This was the final stage of the ritual, the shared nightcap meant to ease nervousness and solidify the bond. Ilara had expected this small concession to tradition. It was sloppy, common, and therefore essential to her strategy. She approached the tray, her breath held tight. Hidden in the voluminous folds of her sleeve, secured by a single tightly tied thread, was the secondary measure. The sleeping draught Clarissa had received was merely to ensure her absence. The potion prepared for Mr. Davies required no sleep. It required only finality. She slid a small vial from her cuff, barely larger than her thumb, and let the thread fall silently to the thick carpet. The vial contained a concentrated powder derived from a swamp lily known only to those who knew the old ways, a substance that tasted of nothing but sharp wine and stopped the heart with the quiet efficiency of a snapped thread. She poured the brandy, letting the liquid slosh gently in the crystal. One glass she left untouched, its amber contents pure. The other she treated with swift precision, tapping the powder into the depths of the glass. It dissolved immediately, leaving no trace, not even a film on the glass. She placed the glass intended for Davies closer to the decanter, a position of easy access for a man who would assume the first pour was his due. The silence in the room stretched, thick and profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire. She waited, standing straight, her hands clasped loosely before her, ready for the sound of boots on the stairs. It came precisely on the half hour, a heavy, confident stride that announced ownership before the man even appeared. Mr. Davies, whose full given name was Bartholomew, entered the chamber as if he were taking possession of a newly acquired deed. He was tall, ruddy-faced, and possessed the hearty, ill-concealed self-satisfaction of a man who had successfully leveraged political influence into a substantial dowry. He had seen Ilara, the supposed Clarissa, only through the gauzy veil of the wedding ceremony and the crowded reception, but even the briefest glance had assured him of her docility. He was buying a good name and a beautiful, if silent, decoration. "Well, wife," Davies boomed, closing the door with a loud click that made Ilara flinch internally, though her face remained frozen in the prescribed modest stillness. He shed his heavy velvet coat onto a nearby chair, already loosening the knot of his cravat. "A long day, eh? You'll forgive me if I forego the poetry. Business is business, even tonight." He moved toward the brandy tray, his eyes on the prize. He did not look at Ilara, who stood patiently near the bed. This was key. He saw only the expectation of his pleasure, not the woman fulfilling it. He was predictable in his greed. He reached immediately for the glass positioned closest to the bottle, the one Ilara had prepared. "You're a quiet one, Clarissa," he chuckled, lifting the glass and raising it briefly in a dismissive salute to her. "A virtue, I assure you. No man wants a wife who talks more than she listens." He took a deep, satisfied draught, draining half the glass in a single movement. The brandy was strong, masking the subtle acridity of the lily powder. Ilara offered no reply. She walked slowly toward the bed, the movement graceful, deliberately distracting. She began the slow, arduous process of unfastening the hundreds of tiny buttons that ran down the back of the wedding gown. It was a gesture of yielding, designed to focus his attention entirely on the physical display, not the chemical reaction already beginning inside him. Davies finished the brandy. He let out a loud, gusting sigh of pleasure. "Ah, that hits the spot. Fetch the other glass, girl." Ilara paused. This was the first deviation. She had planned for him to pour his own second drink. If she touched the other glass now, the symmetry of her strategy would be disrupted. But defiance was not an option. Without a word, she turned back to the tray, carefully picking up the untouched glass. She held it out, her face still impassive, gazing slightly past his left ear. Davies took the second glass, but his eyes were not on the liquid. They were already stripping the lace and silk from her body. "You are truly a beauty, Clarissa. Your father drove a hard bargain, but I concede the product is worth the price." He took a third glass from the tray, poured another hefty measure of brandy from the decanter, and began to sip. Ilara resumed the unbuttoning process, the silk slipping around her fingers. She could feel the subtle shift in the air, the acceleration of the plan's terrible momentum. Davies's face was becoming flushed, far beyond the warmth of the alcohol. His breathing, initially robust, was beginning to acquire a slight, almost imperceptible hitch. The substance was fast, too fast for his system to fully process the initial shock. He moved toward her, his breath heavy with liquor and anticipation. He reached out, his thick fingers grasping the pearl necklace around her throat, Clarissa's wedding gift. "Enough of this tedious clothing," he slurred, impatience replacing charm. "Let me help." He yanked at the gown's fabric where she had already unfastened a dozen buttons. The material tore, not cleanly, but with a satisfying ripping sound. He laughed, a deep, unpleasant rumble. And then, just as his hand brushed her shoulder, the systemic shock hit. The laugh choked in his throat, morphing into a sound of strained disbelief. His eyes, fixed on Ilara, widened, not in recognition of her, but in pure animal panic as his body betrayed him. He tried to speak, perhaps to call for a servant, a doctor, or his new father-in-law, but only a wet, bubbling sound escaped. He staggered backward, dropping the brandy glass. The crystal hit the thick carpet with a dull thud, not shattering, saving Ilara the headache of explaining broken glass to a maid in the morning. Davies's face was now a mottled purple. He clutched his chest, his powerful frame folding in on itself. He looked less like a man of power and more like a discarded puppet. Ilara stood still, maintaining the posture of a terrified bride witnessing a calamity. She watched him fall, the sound of his body hitting the floor, masked slightly by the roaring in her own ears. It was over, almost before it began. A spasm, a final rattling gasp, and then silence. Bartholomew Davies, planter and politician, the man whose actions had led to the ruin of 3 families on his neighboring estate, was now merely a very heavy, inconvenient object. The wedding night had indeed come to pass. Ilara allowed herself a slow, controlled intake of breath. The air felt cleaner now, despite the lingering smell of brandy and extinguished life. This was the moment of maximum danger, the transition from act to cover-up. She had approximately 4 hours until the household woke, and the chambermaid Mary arrived with morning coffee. 4 hours to ensure this was categorized as a tragedy, not murder. She stepped over Davies's inert body. The wedding dress was now an obstacle, heavy and restricting. She moved to the dressing screen, disappearing behind the folding silk panels, and worked quickly to remove the gown. She handled the fabric with cold, professional disinterest, folding it carefully, concealing the tear Davies had made. The tear was a benefit. It suggested struggle or passion, not poison. Clad only in her shift, Ilara returned to the scene. Her hands, which had trembled slightly when she prepared the poison, were now perfectly steady. Her first task was psychological. Remove any suggestion of foul play. She picked up the decanter and the 2 glasses, rinsing them quickly in the wash basin hidden behind a velvet curtain. She needed the cause of death to remain firmly fixed on the man's excessive appetite, not on her quiet precision. Next, the body. Davies had fallen awkwardly, a position that immediately suggests violence. She took hold of his heavy shoulders, bracing her feet on the thick rug, and pulled. It took all her cultivated strength, the kind born from years of back-breaking kitchen work, to move him. She dragged him a short distance, positioning him near the edge of the bed, his head resting against a carved post. She manipulated his limbs until his posture suggested a sudden, paralyzing seizure, a common enough occurrence among men of means who overindulged in food, drink, and stress. a stroke, or perhaps a sudden fatal heart spasm brought on by the excitement of the evening. That was the narrative. Her final and most crucial act was the securing of the package. Her entire masquerade, the calculated risk of poisoning a powerful man in his own home, was not solely about revenge for the lost families, but about retrieving a specific item. She searched his clothing quickly, efficiently. His pockets held only coins, a pocket watch, and a heavy signet ring. Useless. The object she sought would not be kept on his person on a wedding night. It would be secured. Ilara remembered the small, wrought-iron safe built into the chimney breast, hidden behind a loose portrait of Davies's deceased mother. She had observed Davies using it during a brief cleaning assignment in this room 2 months prior, noting the sequence of clicks as he turned the small dial. Davies, like many men of his ilk, believed his actions were unobserved, his secrets secured by the sheer weight of his authority. She knelt before the chimney breast. The portrait was heavy, ornately framed. She lifted it carefully, leaning it against the wall. The safe door was small, no more than a foot square. Ilara placed her ear against the cool iron. She began to turn the dial, not rushing, counting the rotations by the rhythm of her own slow heartbeat. 3 full turns left, past the smooth spots, past the initial resistance, stopping exactly where the tumblers should align. Then 2 rights, pausing fractionally longer before the final single turn left. Click. The lock mechanism responded with a soft, final sigh. Ilara paused, savoring the small mechanical victory. This was the true taste of triumph. Not the sudden death of her oppressor, but the silent, systematic dismantling of his defenses. She pulled the door open. Inside, illuminated by the faint glow of the fire, were several bundles of promissory notes, some loose diamonds, and a roll of official-looking papers, tightly bound with a crimson ribbon. This was it. The land deeds and the contracts Davies had used to illegally acquire the acreage belonging to the free black families along the Edisto River, the very families whose sons had been sold south by Davies's influence. Ilara extracted the papers. They were crisp and brittle. She did not need to read them. She knew the cursive signature of the county clerk and the unmistakable seal of the district. She rolled the bundle tightly and tucked it into the lining of the shift she wore, using a few quick stitches of thread she had secreted in her hair. The evidence of his crime and the proof of the family's legal right to reclaim their land was now secured beneath Clarissa's undergarments. She closed the safe door and spun the dial wildly, locking it with a random sequence. She replaced the heavy portrait. The chamber was almost ready. She extinguished the oil lamps, leaving only the soft glow of the embers in the hearth, casting long, nervous shadows that danced across Davies's face. If the maid found him at dawn, she would assume he had succumbed in the dark during a private moment, overwhelmed by the celebration. Ilara needed to disappear, but not before delivering one final, devastating blow. This was not a quick, clean act of vengeance. It was an act of profound, calculated sabotage designed to unravel the entire infrastructure of this house, this family, and their reliance on the institution of slavery. She put on the discarded coat of Mr. Davies. It was massive, overwhelming her slight frame, the velvet smelling faintly of expensive tobacco and sweat. The coat contained a generous inner pocket, perfect for the few necessities she had prepared. She retrieved the small carved wooden owl she had kept since childhood, a meaningless charm, but a link to the life she was about to definitively abandon. She also secured the $200 in gold coin she had painstakingly skimmed from the plantation kitchen accounts over the last 4 years, earned from selling Mrs. Davies's surplus pecans to the local bakery. She moved back to the door, pulling the heavy coat tight around her. Before she left, she looked at the silent form of Davies on the floor, then at the empty side of the bed, the silk pillows undisturbed. She opened the door a crack. The hallway was dark, silent. the air heavy with the false peace of a sleeping house. She descended the grand staircase again, but this time she was not Ilara the maid or Clarissa the bride. She was simply a thief of justice, carrying the weight of stolen land deeds and a monumental secret. As she passed the sitting room, she glanced in. Clarissa lay precisely where Ilara had left her hours ago, curled on the fainting couch, pale and still, an innocent collateral victim of her father's sins. The girl was oblivious, floating in a medicated haze. Ilara felt a peculiar sting of pity, a brief, professional assessment of a tragedy averted. Clarissa would wake to a shock, but she would wake alive, freed from a marriage that would have ultimately devoured her spirit as surely as the plantation devoured souls. Ilara continued her descent, reaching the main floor. The front door was locked, bolted and chained, typical security for a man who knew he had enemies both seen and unseen. But Ilara did not need the front door. She moved through the drawing room and into the back parlor, where the house's library was situated. Her plan hinged on a small, insignificant detail that she had discovered weeks ago while polishing brass. A slightly loose pane of glass in the bottom window of the library, concealed by heavy velvet drapes. She pushed the drape aside. The window latch was simple. She wedged a small, thin blade, a butter knife she had stolen from the kitchen, into the frame and worked the latch free. The pane itself needed to be removed. She used a scrap of flannel soaked in turpentine, pressing it against the glazing putty until it softened. Slowly, carefully, she worked the pane free. The window now offered a gap just large enough for her to slide through. She stepped out, pulling the heavy Davies coat through the opening, landing silently on the damp, cold earth of the garden. The air was frigid, the moon high and mocking. She quickly replaced the pane, leaving no visible trace from the exterior that the window had ever been disturbed. She was outside, but she was still on Davies' land. Ilara moved quickly along the back perimeter of the house, heading toward the stables. The destination was critical. She needed more than just distance. She needed transport and a distraction that would buy her vital hours. The stables smelled of hay, manure, and the familiar, comforting warmth of living animals. Davies kept only 2 prime riding horses, both restless, high-strung beasts. Ilara did not go for the horses. Instead, she went to the storage shed beside the tack room, where the less valuable but equally functional farm animals were housed. She retrieved 2 kerosene lanterns and a heavy coil of hemp rope. Her true objective was tucked away in the deepest corner of the shed, the single, battered farm cart used for hauling feed from the lower fields. It was slow, loud, and utterly disposable. She secured the lanterns, then moved back to the horse stalls. Davies's prized mare, a fiery bay named Jezebel, nickered nervously at Ilara's presence, sensing the wrongness of the hour. Ilara spoke to her in Gula, the low, melodic language of the coast that the mare knew only from the stable hands. The horse settled instantly. Ilara did not intend to ride Jezebel. Instead, using the stolen farm cart, the kerosene, and the rope, she began the second, far more visible act of her vengeance. It was a strategy born of necessity. If they were looking for a silent, runaway maid, they would never find a woman who had just created a massive diversion designed to burn her bridges. Literally, she soaked the hemp rope thoroughly in kerosene. She tied one end securely to the harness of the mare, leading the rope out of the stall through the main door of the stable and a significant distance into the largest feed barn. She was careful to ensure the path of the kerosene-soaked rope led directly past the dry, tinder-like hay stored in the loft. Davies had taken everything from the families, their land, their pride, and their future. The land deeds were secured, reclaiming the future. Now, for the pride and the past. Ilara backed the farm cart out slowly. She hitched Jezebel to the cart and prepared the lantern. She placed the lit lantern precisely where it would ignite the kerosene-soaked rope within the next 20 minutes, timed to the wind direction and the slow burn of the saturated fibers. She climbed onto the cart, pulling the heavy velvet coat tight. The mare, initially confused, began to respond to the soft, rhythmic click of Ilara's tongue. They moved slowly, deliberately, away from the complex of buildings, heading south toward the swamps that bordered the Edisto River. She did not look back. She did not need to. The fire would be loud, visible for miles, and would consume the central barn, the stables, and perhaps, with a bit of luck, the detached kitchen house. The alarm would be raised not by the quiet death in the main house, but by the furious roar of flames consuming thousands of dollars of hay, equipment, and livestock. When the discovery came, first the fire, then the dead master upstairs, the authorities would assume a runaway slave, perhaps a disgruntled field hand, had sought destruction before freedom. They would search for a brute covered in soot and running on foot. They would never look for a bride sitting calmly in a farm cart, disguised in a planter's velvet coat, carrying the true crime evidence hidden beneath her shift. The timing was impeccable. She was nearly a mile away when the first orange light bloomed against the eastern horizon. It was not the soft, hesitant light of dawn. It was the fierce, hungry, vengeful light of the fire at Davies's landing. Ilara urged the mare faster, the cart rattling loudly over the dirt track. She had traded silence for noise, anonymity for visible destruction, and the perceived vulnerability of the maid for the cold-blooded efficiency of the strategist. The deed was done. The complication was now the furious, organized hunt that would begin within the hour. She had burned the house down metaphorically by murdering its master, and physically by torching his livelihood. Now, she simply needed to survive the ashes. The river was ahead, and with it the treacherous, welcoming darkness of the swamp. The river smelled of wet decay, and 1,000 living things submerged in the unending rot. Edisa did not pause at the bank. To stand on solid ground was to offer a trail. The fire back on the Thornhill property was a furious red eye, winking miles behind her. But the wind was shifting, bringing the acrid tang of burnt timber directly to the marshland. That scent would cover much, but not the human dread clinging to her sweat and clothes. She stepped not into the deep channel, but onto the edge of the waterline, moving with a desperate, low crouch where the reeds met the muck. Every footfall was a strategic decision. She had spent months observing how the runaway dogs worked, how the slave catchers, the professional ones, not just the drunken overseers, tracked prey. They expected fear to make a slave run straight, fast, and desperate for dry ground. They expected the river to be crossed at the narrowest point, the quickest route to the next jurisdiction. Edisa, however, was heading into the water, moving parallel to the bank, letting the low tide wash over her ankles and erase the crisp edges of her prints. The night was the blackest blanket imaginable. A moonless sky covered the world, and the only light came from the distant flicker of the fire, already fading to a haze of smoke on the horizon. The sound came next, a deep rising baying carried clean over the open fields. Not one dog, 4, maybe 5, working in coordinated terror. That sound was the heartbeat of the South, a rhythm of chase and capture, and it hammered against Edisa's ribs, threatening to shatter the cold control she had cultivated since the decision was made. Control. She repeated the word internally, a mantra against the instinct to panic. The first riders were distinguishable now, shouts carrying across the low ground, echoes bouncing off the cypress knees. They would ride hard to the river crossing, assuming she was already making for the main road on the far side. They would not expect her to willingly become part of the swamp itself. She reached into the pocket sewn inside the hem of her skirt. Inside were not just the few meager provisions she carried, but a small, heavy pouch of finely ground sulfur and ash mixed with stale animal fat. It was a miserable, acrid mix designed to confuse and repel. She smeared the paste low on her ankles and boots, covering the smell of the damp leather and the earth she had disturbed. It was a crude defense, but time was her only currency, and she needed to buy minutes, perhaps an hour, before the dogs learned to ignore the foulness and focus on the fear beneath. The true challenge of the swamp was not the water, but the life within it. Every step risked a viper hidden in the water grasses, or the silent, sluggish movement of an alligator seeking the relative warmth of the mud. Her body was a roadmap of bruises and aches already, but she moved with the unnatural precision of someone whose life depended on geometric awareness. Root here, muck there, step lightly, breathe. She spent the next hour moving approximately 3 miles parallel to the main river current, allowing the water and the rising tide to further obliterate her initial entry point. The baying was closer now, louder, sharper, but it was circling. The dogs were confused. They were detecting scent, yes, but not a clear line. The smell was broken, dispersed, mixed with the sulfur and the overwhelming stench of the marsh. "They went towards the ferry!" a shout echoed, distinct enough to tell that the riders were already separating, following the easiest, most predictable route. A moment of pure, savage satisfaction pierced the dread. They were predictable. That was the central flaw of all their power. They believed their position made them omniscient, that their prey must be simple. Adisa had gambled on their arrogance, and the first turn of the chase had gone her way. She knew she could not stop. The main channel of the river still lay ahead, a dark barrier marking the final push towards the loosely organized network of safe houses far to the north. But first, she had to cross the low-lying basin known locally as the Dead Man's Hand, a stretch of treacherous, unstable land notorious for quicksand and unseen holes. As she entered the denser cypress thicket, the shouts of the riders faded, replaced by the persistent, closer sound of the dogs. One specific hound, a large black and tan creature known simply as Reaper, was often hired out to the surrounding plantations. Reaper was legendary for his focus, and his baying was different, less wild, more measured, a rhythmic hunting drumbeat that meant he was locking onto something, even if it was faint. Adisa ducked under a low-hanging branch, feeling the cold water of the swamp up to her knees. She pulled herself onto a small, dry island clump of earth, barely larger than a table, hidden by massive fern fronds. She needed 5 minutes, not for rest, but for observation and further preparation. She reached into her boot and pulled out the small, weighted knife she had taken from the kitchen, not for the murder, which required silence, but for defense against the wild. The metal was cold and comforting. She pressed her back against the rough bark of the cypress tree, allowing the exhaustion to hit her in a brief, controlled wave. The darkness was her friend, but it also masked the precise location of Reaper. The sound of the dog stopped, not faded, stopped. Adisa's blood turned to ice. A hound stopping means 2 things. Either it lost the scent completely and is now confused and whining, or it has found something specific and is waiting for instruction, or worse, moving silently to close the distance. Reaper was not known for whining. She scanned the black mass of the swamp. Nothing, only the reflection of the distant high stars in the still water. Then she heard it, not a crash, not a bay, but a subtle click. The sound of metal, a heavy boot buckle perhaps, scraping against the root of a tree. Someone was tracking her on foot, using the dogs as a distraction and following the subtle signs she left despite her efforts. This was not a tired overseer. This was a professional. A few plantations over, there was a man known as Silas Cade. He didn't own land, he owned tracking. Cade charged $5 a day and $50 per capture. He was meticulous, cold, and never spoke a word unless it was an instruction to his dogs. If Cade was involved, Adisa knew her time was measured in minutes, not hours. She moved off the dry clump, back into the water, heading deeper into the most impossible section of the Dead Man's Hand. This was the point of no return. If she became stuck here, the only thing that would find her was the cold, sluggish embrace of the mud. But the danger was also her greatest ally. Cade, for all his skill, was still human, and the swamp treated all men equally. Adisa remembered the stories whispered in the quarters, tales of runaway slaves who had used the swamp not as a hiding place, but as a weapon. They talked of the Gator Road, a barely discernible path only known to a few, running beneath the surface of the deepest water, bypassing the treacherous quicksand areas. Her grandmother, who was a midwife and knew every herb and path for 20 miles, had shown her that path when she was just a child, warning her never to use it unless death was the alternative. Death was the alternative. The water was now at her chest, cold and paralyzing. She felt the thick, slimy sensation of underwater moss and algae brushing against her face. She focused on the barely visible shapes of the cypress roots, using them as submerged guideposts. She heard Reaper again, closer this time, a low, frustrated whimper turning into a hard, short bark. He had found the trail again, despite the sulfur. The dog was directly behind her, perhaps 50 yards back. And then she heard Cade's voice, gravelly and calm, cutting through the night. "Steady, boy, it ain't far now, she's tired." Cade had tracked her entry point, ignored the diversion toward the ferry, and was now moving straight into the heart of the mire, relying on Reaper to pinpoint the exact location. Adisa plunged forward, holding her breath, pushing her head down until the cold water was almost covering her ears. She needed to reach the small, narrow canebrake known as the Widow's Weave, a mass of dense, thorny thicket where the river flowed into the swamp basin, making any forward movement painful and slow, but offering the best possible concealment. The thought of turning back, of simply waiting for Cade to find her, flared momentarily, a warm, tempting resignation. But then, the image of Master Thornhill, the smug satisfaction on his face as he sold the last of her mother's belongings, flashed in her mind. No, the work was not done. The price had been paid in blood, and she would not relinquish the small, terrible piece that payment had bought her. She emerged from the deepest water and into the canebrake. The canes were razor-sharp, slicing at her exposed skin, drawing beads of dark blood that instantly mixed with the swamp mud. She moved meticulously, snapping only the dead canes, stepping only where she knew the ground held firm. Cade was shouting again, closer. "I see the reeds moving! Reaper, get her!" The dog surged forward, the sound of its heavy breathing cutting through the humid air. Adisa could see the dog now, a dark shape moving too fast through the reeds, its eyes reflecting the faint, distant light like twin embers. This was the climax, the sudden, terrible confrontation she had planned for, but prayed against. She did not run deeper into the canebrake. She stopped, turning slightly, making herself an impossible target within the tangle of thorns. She had one advantage. She knew where the ground ended. Cade was moving too fast, relying on the dog to drive the prey out. He was perhaps 30 feet behind Reaper. Adisa took the weighted knife and threw it, not at the dog, but at a specific cluster of dry, heavy reeds, 10 feet to the left of Reaper's path. The sound was a loud, sharp snap, the noise suggesting a human body struggling. Reaper, trained to pursue, instantly veered toward the sound. Adisa dropped low, becoming almost invisible. Reaper rushed the perceived struggling figure. The moment the dog hit the spot where Adisa aimed the knife, the ground gave way. It was a deep, natural quicksand pit that Adisa's grandmother had marked decades ago with specific placements of dead wood. A trap only visible if you were looking down from above in daylight. The dog vanished instantly with a sharp, choked yelp, the thick muck swallowing the sound and the struggling creature whole. The scent, the guide, the terrifying focus of the chase was gone. Silence. A profound, absolute silence, broken only by the frantic breathing of Silas Cade. Cade stopped dead. He hadn't seen the pit, but he saw the precise spot where his most valuable asset had disappeared. He pulled the heavy rifle from his shoulder. "Show yourself!" Cade's voice was rough, laced with genuine shock and fury. "You killed my dog!" Adisa remained still. She was now only 15 feet from Cade, shielded by the dense, thorny wall of the canebrake. She could smell the cheap tobacco on his breath. She focused not on his face, but on the precise location of his rifle. Cade took a cautious step forward, moving slowly, his eyes darting through the blackness. He was now relying entirely on sound and movement, assuming she was still running away from him. Adisa had prepared for this moment years ago when she observed the men cutting sugarcane near the river bend. She knew that the thick cane, when bent and partially snapped, but still attached to the root, created a lethal tripwire, impossible to see in the dark. As Cade took his second hesitant step into the thicket, his foot caught the unseen wire. He did not merely trip. The unexpected movement in the tight, uneven terrain caused him to lose balance, and the rifle discharged instantly, the deafening roar echoing across the swamp, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the scene in a brilliant, shocking white. Just long enough for Adisa to see the look of stark terror on Cade's face as he plunged headfirst into the deep, sluggish water of the adjacent river eddy. The force of the fall drove the air from his lungs. The heavy boots and thick coat worked against him instantly. Adisa heard the gurgling, frantic splash, the sound of a man trying desperately to find purchase in water that offered none. She did not move toward him. She did not watch him struggle. She had learned long ago that in the swamp, the environment did the work of the executioner. The last sound was a heavy, sinking ripple. Adisa pushed herself back through the thorny canebrake, moving away from the violent silence. She was bleeding from 100 small cuts, trembling not from fear, but from the sudden, profound release of tension. The most dangerous human threat had been eliminated, not by strength, but by calculated knowledge of the terrain. She had secured the necessary head start. The rifle shot, however, served as a beacon, announcing her general location to every plantation owner and authority within 5 miles. The organized hunt would now turn its full focus to the swamp's main artery. She had to move fast, using the brief window of confusion the shot had created. She emerged on the opposite side of the canebrake, her body shivering in the cold, wet night. The main river channel was directly ahead, wider here, deeper, and moving with a noticeable current. Beyond it lay the pine forests, and beyond the pines, a long, difficult trek toward the northern rail line. Adisa stripped off the heavier layers of her soaked clothes, leaving only the thin, rough linen beneath. The weight would slow her down. She tied the remaining provisions and the small knife tightly around her waist. She looked across the dark, silent water. The murder of Thornhill was vengeance. The death of Cade was survival. Now she faced the ultimate test, crossing the dark divide, knowing that even if she reached the far bank, her journey had just truly begun. She slid into the river, allowing the cold current to drag her south briefly before she fought, stroke by stroke, toward the distant, unseen shore. The water was a freezing, suffocating weight, but she pushed against it, fueled by a singular, sharp clarity. She was no longer running from the gallows. She was running toward the impossibility of a life chosen by herself. Each stroke was a repudiation of Thornhill, of Cade, and of the entire system that had tried to define her worth by the strength of her back. The far bank remained a promise shrouded in darkness, yet it was a promise she intended to keep, no matter the cost in muscle and breath. She swam until her arms felt like lead weights, and the cold threatened to pull her under, until the smell of the swamp was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of the flowing river water, and the distant shouts of the frustrated hunters sounded like the faint cries of a world she had successfully left behind, or perhaps destroyed. She pushed through the final yards, dragging her exhausted body onto the wet, foreign mud of the north bank, collapsing not in surrender, but in the final, necessary moment of rest before the long walk began. The sun would rise in a few hours, revealing the extent of the disaster she had left in her wake, but she was not there to see it. She was here, alone, alive, and utterly committed to the deadly gamble she had started just hours before. The true cost of freedom was yet to be calculated, but the first installment had been paid in full. The cold was a blessing. It drove the blood deep, steadying the shiver that had threatened to seize her bones back in the parlor. Harriet moved west, away from the river, away from the immediate frantic search that would follow the morning's grim discovery. Her feet, long accustomed to the precise measured pace required of a house servant, now adopted the uneven, tearing gait of the hunted. Every muscle screamed, but the voice that screamed loudest was quickly silenced by a colder, more resolute certainty. She was free only as long as she moved. She had planned the route meticulously for years, maps burned into her memory. Not the grand surveyor's maps Master Thorne studied, but the maps of the enslaved. The dried creek beds, the thickets of black willow that obscured the path, the precise latitude where the swamp water deepened enough to throw off the scent of any hound. She knew every dip in the land, every hollow log big enough to hide a man or a woman, and the times of the moon when the dense cypress cover offered near-perfect blackout. The first hint of discovery came not from the sound of pursuit, but from the cessation of noise she expected. By now, the cook, Old Man Silas, would have started the fire. The stable boys would be stirring. Instead, a profound, unnatural silence hung in the humid pre-dawn air, heavy and absolute, broken only by the distant, panicked chime of the emergency bell from the big house. It was not the dinner bell, demanding service. It was the alarm, demanding terror. The chaos had begun. Harriet pressed herself into a cluster of high cattails by the edge of a frozen drainage ditch. She did not stop to listen for long, knowing that the paralysis of observation was the greatest risk. The sound of the alarm told her everything she needed to know about the immediate aftermath: panic, disbelief, and the self-serving delusion of the white residents. They would never suspect the quiet girl who refilled their glasses. They would look for a gang of runaway men, perhaps a disgruntled field hand, or maybe even abolitionists from the north. Anything but the woman whose movements they had deemed irrelevant for 2 decades. She crossed the ditch, the icy water biting through the worn leather of her boots, and started toward the old logging road that led eventually toward the western settlements of the mountains. Thorne's plantation abutted Colonel Ramsay's land to the north, and Ramsay was the local sheriff. Thorne's son, the heir apparent now lying in the upstairs parlor, had been Ramsay's godson. The search would be relentless, personal, and swift. Harriet traveled the next 6 hours on pure adrenaline and cold logic. She consumed the piece of hard biscuit and salted meat she had wrapped days ago in oilcloth, washing it down with water drawn carefully from the flowing center of a small creek. She left the logging road quickly, cutting into the deep forest, using the dense scrub to erase her trail. Every 50 yards she backtracked 10, disrupting the pattern of her prints, walking through water when possible, or stepping precisely onto the hard, exposed roots of oak trees. By mid-morning, the sound of the hounds finally reached her, a distant baying chorus that carried on the still air. They were closer than she expected, meaning Ramsay had wasted no time. His dogs were famously fast, imported from Cuba, and trained for the rugged terrain. But they were trained to track fear, to follow the clumsy path of a desperate man. They were not trained for the meticulous, calculating passage of a ghost. The dogs passed less than a quarter mile to her south, their frantic, confused noise momentarily splitting the silence of the woods. They were following the straightest, most obvious route, the logging road, assuming she would head immediately north to the state line. But Harriet knew the geography of their arrogance. She was heading west, deeper into the unsettled mountain gaps, aiming for a small community of free blacks known only through whisper networks, a place where Thorne's jurisdiction meant nothing and where the law of the land was the law of mutual defense. She heard the shouts of the men, white men, their voices ringing with entitlement and fury, mixed with the howls of the dogs. It was a sound that had been the background score to her life, but hearing it now, chasing her specifically, transformed the fear into a cold, hard clarity. She had gambled her life for this moment. She would not lose it to poor woodsmanship. That evening, As the search intensified, the whispers began at Thorne's plantation. Not the formal, terrified confessions extracted by the overseers, but the low, knowing murmurs in the slave quarters. They had seen the sheriff's posse ride out. They had seen the absolute shattering disbelief on Mistress Thorne's face, and they knew what the white folk did not, that the 4 men found dead, Thorne himself, his eldest son, the brutal overseer, and the visiting lawyer who specialized in slave litigation, had been executed with a precision born of intimate knowledge. The enslaved community did not openly celebrate. They were silent, their faces impassive when questioned, but the air was charged. A collective breath of vindication had been drawn. They recognized the signature, the cool patience, the perfect timing. It was the housewoman, the quiet one, the invisible one who never spoke above a functional whisper. It was Harriet. Silas, the elderly cook, who had worked side by side with Harriet for years, was interrogated first. He told them he had seen nothing, heard nothing. But as he scrubbed the copper pots later that night, he allowed himself a small, internal smile. He remembered Harriet asking him 3 months ago about the properties of certain wild mountain herbs he used for seasoning. He had been confused, as she only cooked in the main house. Now he understood. She hadn't been seasoning a dinner, she had been seasoning the future. The sheriff's posse returned empty-handed after 3 days. Their pride was wounded. They declared it the work of outside agitators, perhaps a rogue gang of river pirates. They refused to entertain the notion that the attack was internal, to admit that one of their own, a woman they owned, whom they had defined as property, who existed only to serve, could conceive and execute such a brutal, calculated act, was to admit the fundamental instability of their entire world. Their failure to capture her was not a failure of tracking, it was a failure of imagination. Harriet pressed deeper into the Appalachian foothills. The landscape was brutal. She was forced to climb steep inclines, her clothes tearing on briar patches. She rationed her food severely. The cold gave way to sleet, and she huddled under a rocky overhang, fighting off the encroaching sickness that exposure brought. This was the true cost, she realized, not the initial terrifying act of murder, which was quick and clean, but the agonizing, slow price of survival afterward. On the 5th day, she reached the place on her mental map, an old, overgrown logging trail leading to the summit of Black Ridge. She was weak, favoring her left ankle, but she had to reach the Hawk's Nest settlement before the heavy winter snows blocked the passes. She encountered her first human contact that afternoon. It was not a slave catcher, but a lone figure riding a mule, cloaked and hooded against the weather. He was an elderly black man, rugged and silent, carrying a rifle and a coil of rope. He was known only as Pa Elijah, one of the first founders of the Hawk's Nest. Harriet emerged slowly from the tree line, hands open, showing she carried no weapon. She was a ruin of a woman, mud-caked, eyes hollowed by exhaustion, but her posture was straight. "You're far from the river, girl," Pa Elijah said, his voice deep and gravelly. He didn't lower his rifle. "I'm heading for the nest," she whispered, her throat dry and raw. He studied her, not with suspicion, but with a deep, weary appraisal. He was looking at her feet, her wounds, and then finally into her eyes. He saw the cold, determined fire there, the kind that survived the terror of the hunt. "The word came up the mountain 2 days ago," he said slowly, "about Thorne and the others." Harriet did not flinch, did not confirm or deny. She merely held his gaze. Pa Elijah nodded once, a quick, almost imperceptible motion. "They're saying abolitionists did it. They're saying it was a rogue mob." He spat on the ground. "We know the truth, girl. Those men weren't cut down by strangers. They were culled." He dismounted the mule and gestured toward a small sack tied to the saddle. "Eat, and then we move fast. Ramsey's men finally figured out the western route this morning. They're 2 hours behind, and they're riding fresh horses." And the encounter transformed the journey from a desperate flight into a managed expedition. Pa Elijah did not ask her story, nor did he offer pity. He offered logistics, fresh boots, proper trail food, and the knowledge of the mountain passes that only the free people possessed. He was the embodiment of the resistance collective she had dreamed of, a network of silent support built over decades, waiting for the moments when individual courage demanded collective aid. They rode, Harriet on the mule, Pa Elijah walking silently beside her through the night, guided by the stars and the unceasing vigilance of the old man. The mountain passes were narrow, treacherous, covered in patches of black ice. At dawn, they reached the Nest, a hidden valley community, self-sufficient and heavily defended, populated by runaways and freeborn people who chose isolation over submission. The first few weeks in the Nest were a blur of recovery. Harriet's ankle healed, the bruises faded, and the exhaustion lifted slowly. She changed her name, taking the new name Calla, after the quiet, resilient flower that thrived in damp, shaded earth. She worked not in a grand house, but in the community fields, side by side with women and men whose lives were now fiercely, absolutely their own. But the story of the thorn plantation did not end with her escape. It had set off a chain reaction. The death of the patriarch and the primary heir destabilized the entire Thorn empire. The remaining son, weak-willed and fearful, tried to manage the crops, but he lacked the cruelty and the ruthless efficiency of his father and brother. The enslaved people, emboldened by the silent truth of Harriet's action, began to resist in small, constant ways. Slowdowns in the fields, tools strategically broken, fires that started mysteriously in the tobacco barns. The production dropped precipitously. The remaining son, overwhelmed by debt and the ghostly terror that one of the quiet servants might also possess the same lethal patience, finally sold the property. It was sold in pieces to different, less successful owners. The grand house, once the center of power and cruelty, fell into disrepair, becoming a symbol of a dynasty fractured by internal, unseen resistance. The local community of slaveholders tried to suppress the truth, but the story of the quiet housewoman who brought down the entire house became a folklore among the enslaved for 100 miles around. It was a legend of justice, delivered not by a vengeful god, but by a calculating mind, armed only with knowledge and timing. Years passed. The war finally came. Calla, now in her 40s, became a crucial link in the intelligence network running through the mountain communities and into the Union lines. Her ability to remember details, her quiet observation, and her complete mastery of the human element made her invaluable. She wrote reports, passed messages, and provided logistical support, ensuring that the Union scouts understood the terrain and the loyalties of the region. The knowledge she had accumulated as a marginalized servant, now serving the cause of ultimate liberation. She never returned south. She never sought out her old community directly, understanding that her existence was more powerful as a legend than as a known, traceable person. Her freedom was hard-won, built on calculated sacrifice, not on passive waiting. In 1865, when news of the surrender reached the Hawk's Nest, Calla was working on repairing a roof beam. The celebration was quiet, profound, not hysteria, but a solemn, deep acknowledgement of a promise kept. She stood on the mountain, looking east toward the ravaged landscape of the former Confederacy. Her hands, which once trembled with the effort of carrying heavy trays or scrub brushes, or later were steady as they administered the quiet poison, were now calloused and firm from the labor of free life. The tremor was gone forever. Harriet did not achieve redemption in the conventional sense. She was a killer. But in the brutal arithmetic of the time, where her life and the lives of those she loved were considered less than cattle, her act of destruction became an ultimate act of creation. She had traded 4 worthless lives for the possibility of countless others living fully. Her legacy was not recorded in the official histories of the war or the abolition movement. It existed in the quiet resilience of the Hawk's Nest, which thrived and grew into the future. It existed in the silence of the abandoned Thorn estate, a physical monument to the price of arrogance. And it existed in the courage of every enslaved person who heard the whisper of the woman who waited patiently, who counted the minutes and the steps, and who finally declared in blood and fire that her life was her own. She had paid the first installment, and in the end, the debt was settled in full. The cold, hard logic had delivered the only justice the world would allow her.